there's only one large bed, and we've put out 2 small experimental restored areas.
What's 5?
2. So they have 2 valves. The lower one that that's sort of cup shaped, and then the one on top. And they open the valves, and that's how they pump water through the feet. So they're both bivalve mollusks. The mussel, the oyster is called a sessile bivalve. They glue themselves together, so when they settle, they're stuck for the rest of their life in that spot. Okay, one's a male, one's a female. They spawn their gametes, sperm and eggs, into the water column, and they're fertilized, and that's what the larvae, that picture, that's the developing embryo, so the larvae. Now, okay, that's it, and then it goes on and develops like all animals do. It divides and changes forms, and then it slowly becomes an oyster. In 2 weeks, it's ready to settle and look like an oyster. So it develops pretty quickly. Now, but here, the oysters are in a group of animals that are, well, the term is protandrous. All of them start out as males. They all start out as boys. Then by the second year, typically 2/3, 3/4 have become females. Then by the 3rd year, most all of them are females. Some change back. Protandry is fairly common amongst the invertebrates, but inside them, they would either be producing the sperm or the eggs. If they had both inside, they would both, well, then that's another term. But
how can you, like, tell if the oysters are male or female?
Well, you have to kill them. You can't tell from that, so you have to take the shell off, and then you look, and if there's sperm, it's a little different color than the egg. But you really, they're very similar. You have to put it underneath the microscope to see what the gametes, which one they are, a sperm or an egg.
In the oyster farming, we raise oysters to sell for food. They go to restaurants and sometimes wholesalers, which is just a middleman, which buys larger quantities from us, then they still end up, either way, they end up at restaurants. Occasionally, someone is having a party and wants, a few, 50 for a party, and we can do that too. But basically the way it works is we have to get a license from the Fish and Game Department, and there's lots of rules and regulations, and we have to tell them where it's located, and they have to do a survey. They send divers down to make sure there's no eelgrass or other sensitive ecological features. When we get them, they're very small. They're smaller than your little pinky fingernail, like a little, I don't know, Cheerio, smaller than that. And they go into a bag that has this smaller mesh on it. And they stay closed with a little closer. It's just a plastic pipe that's cut down the middle, and that holds the end of the bag closed. But it's just like an envelope. So when we get them, they're small enough so they don't fall through this mesh. There's just a bunch of old weed crud or whatever in there now. But we put 2,000 oysters, actually up to 2,500, in a bag this big when we first get them. And they grow pretty quickly. So as they grow, they need more space. A 9mm bag. And we also have to reduce the numbers. So from 2,000 in a bag like this when they're small, they'll go to 1,000 in the 6mm bag. We split them again down to, what's half of 1,000?
500.
Thank you. 500 in one of these. And all the while, as the oysters are growing, the barnacles and weeds and algae and other crud that live in this water grows on the bags and these cages too. You can see some of the crud it's dried up now, but one of our biggest tasks is to keep these bags clean. So every few weeks, maybe once a month, we'll have to come out and empty the oysters out of the bag and either scrub it with a brush, or sometimes we just leave it out in the air to air dry in the sun and in the dry weather. And after we split them down to 500, and then 250 is how many a bag like this of full-grown oysters. We bring them to market when they're about 3 inches long, about like that size. And a couple hundred of them will fit in a bag like this. So there are 8 bags that fit into this rack, and we call it an oyster condo because it's just like a chest of drawers, and they slide in like that. And this all sits on the bottom. It's got a rope on it with a little buoy that, you know, floats on the surface so we can find it when we need to pull it up. And pulling these out of the water is a lot of work too, because when it's loaded up with 8 bags and a couple hundred or 500 oysters each, and it's all wet and stuff's growing all over it, these can weigh almost 300 pounds. So our boat has gear on it, like cranes and winches and pulleys that help us lift the stuff out of the water onto the boat so we can do the cleaning and grading and sorting. Again, as they probably mentioned, at one time there were huge oyster reefs and beds in areas like this in the bay, and they were over-harvested. It was really tough on the oyster population because they couldn't reproduce quick enough to keep up with the harvesting. And it's happened with lots of other species, fish, and wildlife over the years.
What are some diseases that oysters can get?
Diseases of the oyster. Well, Dr.
Have yours been pretty healthy?
Could probably answer. I think ours have been pretty good. There's something called a mud blister, which is not really a disease. It's just a pest that gets in between the layers of the shell, and it can make it kind of look funny when you open it. It doesn't really hurt the oyster. But there's a disease called MSX. I'm not sure what those letters stand for, some tongue twister scientific, but it's one of the diseases that has killed oysters out here in the past and other places on the East Coast. We actually use strains of oysters that are bred to be disease resistant. So they cost a little bit more, but we figure it's worth paying a little bit more for seed oysters that have a natural built-in resistance to some of those diseases.
What's the season? Yeah.
Well, oyster farmers, we can harvest our oysters pretty much any time of year. The best time to eat an oyster is actually in the fall or winter around the holidays, because an oyster, obviously it's in the water and it can sense when the water temperature is dropping. In the fall, it says, oh, winter's coming, I better get ready for the winter, because there's very little plankton out here for them to eat in the wintertime, so they're getting ready to hibernate. So they bulk up with food and store fat inside their shells, and that's what they survive on until the food chain kicks in and they start to feed again in the spring. A lot of oysters don't make it through the winter, but so they need to prepare for that long winter, and that means in the fall and early winter they're in prime condition. As far as harvesting, we're not bound by the same rules as harvesting the wild oysters. These are our oysters. We put them there. We can harvest them any time we want.